What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Spring's Reckoning, Part 1. Chicago is requesting our clearing protocols, Sarah announced, marking another pin on the command map. Their temperature just hit -20. They want to launch their own operation. President Whitmore studied the growing list of northern cities preparing for their own winter offensives. After the success in the Twin Cities, every major survivor enclave above the 42nd parallel wanted to replicate their victory. Detroit's National Guard is already mobilizing, General Carlton added. Cleveland, Milwaukee, Buffalo, they all have the cold, but they need the knowledge. In the 3 weeks since Operation Deep Freeze, the Twin Cities had become a fortress of the living. Teams worked around the clock, fortifying buildings, establishing defenses, and most importantly, learning from their success and failures. "Sir," Jamie called out, "Ellen's team has finished their analysis of the adapted infected samples. They're ready to brief." Ellen's face appeared on the main screen, backed by a makeshift lab in the secured Minneapolis hospital complex. "We've confirmed the pattern. The virus doesn't just reanimate the dead, it learns from every host. That's why the strongest people turned fastest. Their own immune systems gave the virus more to work with." "Can we use this?" Whitmore asked. "Maybe. We're seeing evidence that successive generations of infected are actually weaker in some ways. The virus burns through their cellular structure faster. They're more vulnerable to environmental damage." "Like extreme cold," Carlton nodded. "Exactly. But there's a catch." Ellen held up a tissue sample. "The spring thaw won't just release the infected we missed. The warming temperatures will accelerate their decay. All those bodies will create a biological hazard," Whitmore finished. He turned to Carlton. "How many cities can we support operations in simultaneously?" "With our current teams, maybe 3, but we've got volunteers coming in from every secured community, former military, emergency responders, even construction workers. Everyone wants to take back their homes." "Sir," Mitchell interrupted, "Wind Rider advanced teams are reporting from Buffalo. The city's practically intact, minimal fire damage, infrastructure largely preserved. If we can clear it, we'd have the entire upper New York corridor," Sarah finished, already marking potential supply routes. Whitmore studied the map. The Twin Cities were secure, a fortress of the living in the frozen north. But they had maybe 6 weeks of reliable cold left. 6 weeks to clear as many northern cities as possible before spring brought its own challenges. "Sir," Jamie called out, "Chicago team is asking again. Their window of cold is shorter than ours. If they're going to attempt a clearing..." "Get me Mayor Chen," Whitmore ordered. The Chicago leader had maintained a network of survivor communities along Lake Michigan, using the cold lake winds as protection against the infected. "Tom," Ellen interjected, "before you launch more operations, there's something else. The adapted infected we studied. They showed signs of limited communication, not speech but chemical markers, pheromones. If the spring thaw releases enough of them at once, they could start coordinating," Carlton realized, "moving in groups." "Which means we clear everything we can now," Whitmore decided. "Ellen, prepare briefing packets for every city attempting a clearing operation. Jamie, coordinate with the weather service. I want hourly temperature updates for every target zone. Sarah, work with the Wind Riders to establish advanced recon teams." "Sir," Mitchell approached with a tablet. "First civilian engineering report from Minneapolis. They've adapted our fortifications, created new barricade designs. They're calling it the Northern Wall Protocol, using the winter itself as part of the defense system. Whitmore thought of Catherine, of her belief in human ingenuity. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were innovating, adapting, creating new ways to fight back. "Tell Chicago we're sending teams," he ordered. "Same for Detroit and Buffalo. We've got 6 weeks to take back every city we can. Whatever we can't clear, we burn. Whatever we can't burn, we fortify." Outside the PEOC, the bitter wind howled across a transformed Minneapolis. Guard towers rose from secured buildings, their lights sweeping the streets. Construction crews converted office buildings into vertical farms. Survivors, emerging from months of hiding, learned to fight, to build, to believe in victory again. Spring was coming, but winter had taught them how to win. Now they just had to do it fast enough, before the thaw could release a new generation of threats. The race was on. Spring's Reckoning, Part 2. "Buffalo team is in position," General Carlton reported. "Chicago units have secured their first perimeter. Detroit's having problems." Through multiple feeds in the PEOC, President Whitmore watched 3 major operations unfold simultaneously. On the main screen, a tactical map showed green zones of secured territory, slowly expanding in each city. But Detroit's progress was worryingly slow. "Motor City Command report," Whitmore ordered. "Sir," came the strained voice of Colonel Patterson. "The city's infrastructure damage is worse than we thought. Collapsed buildings, frozen water main breaks. The infected are trapped in the rubble. We can't get heavy equipment through." "And manual clearing is too slow," Carlton added. "Too dangerous." "Wait," Sarah interrupted, studying the Detroit feed. "Look at the infected they've managed to clear, the tissue damage patterns." Ellen's face appeared on a secondary screen. "Sending a team to Detroit now. Those patterns, the trapped infected might have undergone a different adaptation process. The pressure, the confined spaces." "Sir," Jamie's voice cut through the discussion. "Chicago team reports unusual infected behavior. They're finding clusters, organized clusters." The Chicago feed showed what he meant. Unlike Minneapolis, where the infected had frozen in place randomly, these were gathered in tight groups, often in sheltered areas. They were working together, Ellen realized. Before they froze, the chemical markers I found, they were already starting to communicate. Whitmore watched the Chicago teams carefully approaching the clusters. Each group of infected seemed positioned near critical infrastructure: power stations, water treatment plants, emergency response centers. "They're not just hunting anymore," he said quietly. "They're targeting strategic locations." "Mr. President," Chen's voice crackled from Buffalo, "we've secured the medical district. Found something you need to see. Sending footage now." The video showed a laboratory freezer, its backup generators somehow still running after months without maintenance. Inside, clearly labeled samples told a chilling story. "Early infection samples," Ellen breathed, "from the first wave. My God. We can track the virus's evolution, see how it changed with each new host." "Sir," Carlton interrupted, "Detroit team is requesting permission to implement Protocol Scorched Earth. They want to burn the collapsed sectors they can't clear. A series of impossible choices. Risk losing Detroit to spring thaw, or destroy major sections of vital infrastructure. Push Chicago teams harder, or give the clustered infected time to thaw and coordinate. Race to study Buffalo's samples, or focus on immediate tactical concerns." "Dad," Sarah said softly, "Mum would say save the knowledge first. We can rebuild buildings." Whitmore nodded. "Get those Buffalo samples to Ellen's team. Detroit, you have authorization for controlled burns. but only after salvage teams sweep for survivors. Chicago needs reinforcement. Sir, Chen radioed from Buffalo. Wind riders report another weather front approaching. Temperature's going to drop again. Maybe our last chance for major clearing before spring. How long? Carlton demanded. 36 hours of deep freeze. After that, weather patterns are shifting. Whitmore studied the tactical feeds. 3 major cities in play, each presenting different challenges, different opportunities. They'd learned so much from Minneapolis, but every new operation brought fresh surprises. Ellen, get your best people to Buffalo. Those samples might be our key to understanding what we're really fighting. General, redirect teams from Minneapolis to Chicago. They need experienced units who understand cluster clearing. Detroit... He paused, thinking of the Motor City's importance to rebuilding civilization. They couldn't lose its industrial capacity, but they couldn't risk a spring thaw disaster either. Detroit gets the Wind Riders and every demolition expert we can spare. Better to destroy strategic sections now than lose the whole city later. As orders went out and teams repositioned, Jamie called out from his weather station. Sir, that front, it's going to hit Chicago first, then Buffalo, then Detroit. A wave of cold moving east. Like nature giving us one last weapon, Sarah added. Whitmore touched his wedding ring, thinking of Catherine's scientific mind. The virus evolved, adapted, learned, but so did humanity. Every city they cleared taught them more, made them stronger, showed them new ways to fight. All teams, he ordered, you have 36 hours. Make them count. Spring's coming, and we're not giving it any armies to thaw. Outside, in 3 major cities, the forces of the living prepared for one last push against the frozen dead. They had science, strategy, and nature itself on their side. They would need every advantage they could get. Spring's Reckoning. Part 3. Buffalo samples are impossible. Ellen's voice shook as she reported from her lab. The earliest infected, they weren't just hosts. The virus was literally rewriting their genetic code. Each new generation became more complex. President Whitmore watched his sister-in-law's hands tremble as she held up test results. Behind her, the Buffalo Medical Center had become a hive of scientific activity, teams working desperately to understand their enemy before the last cold front passed. Temperature dropping in Chicago, Jamie reported. -30 and falling. They've got maybe 18 hours of deep freeze left. Detroit demo teams in position, Carlton added. Wind Riders have marked survival zones. They're ready to begin controlled burns. The tactical map showed all 3 operations now. Chicago's methodical clearing of infected clusters, Buffalo's race to secure vital research, and Detroit's desperate plan to burn away what they couldn't save. Tom, Ellen called urgently. These samples, they're showing something else. The virus doesn't just evolve through hosts. It's accumulating information, learning. The chemical markers we found, they're not just for communication. They're passing data between infected. What kind of data? Whitmore demanded. Everything. Combat tactics, infrastructure knowledge, even immune responses to our weapons. Every infected we kill teaches the others how to survive. The implications hit the command center like a physical blow. Sarah was the first to speak. That's why the Chicago clusters are positioned strategically. They're not just gathering, they're sharing information. Sir, a Chicago team leader's voice cut through. We've got movement in cleared zones. Temperatures still well below 0, but they're moving anyway. The feed showed infected beginning to twitch, to shift, even in the brutal cold. They weren't fully mobile, but they were adapting faster than anyone had predicted. Detroit, begin burn operations now, Whitmore ordered. Chicago, switch to protocol deep burn. Don't leave anything to thaw. Buffalo ... We need more time, Ellen pleaded. These samples, they're showing us how the virus thinks, how it plans. If we can understand that. Multiple breaches. The Chicago feed erupted with urgent calls. They're moving in groups. Coordinated attacks. Temperature still dropping, Jamie reported, bewildered. They shouldn't be able to move at all. Whitmore watched in horror as clusters of infected began to coordinate, even in the devastating cold. They moved slowly, clumsily, but with terrible purpose, targeting weak points in the defensive lines, striking at critical equipment. Ellen, he called, what are we looking at? The virus. It's not just surviving the cold anymore, it's using it. The frozen tissue creates a kind of crystalline network. They're literally using ice formations to transmit signals between infected. Sir, Carlton interrupted, Detroit burns are drawing more infected. They're pushing others into the fires, using them as fuel to thaw faster. The tactical feeds showed the horror unfolding. In Chicago, infected clusters moved like deadly glaciers, sacrificing outer members to protect their cores. In Detroit, burning infected created heat zones that drew and thawed others. And in Buffalo, security breach at the medical center. Ellen's video feed shook. They're targeting the lab specifically. They know, oh God, they know what we're learning. All units, fall back to secured zones, Carlton ordered. Implement maximum burn protocols. We have to... No, Whitmore cut him off. We hold. Ellen, grab what samples you can and get to the backup lab. Chicago, use their coordination against them. Heat charges to draw them into kill zones. Detroit burns everything. Now. Dad. Sarah's voice was steady despite the chaos. Mom would say knowledge is power. Even knowing they can coordinate like this changes everything. Whitmore finished. We're not just fighting monsters anymore. We're fighting an organized enemy. One that learns, adapts, and plans. The next 12 hours were a symphony of desperate battle. Chicago teams used the infected's own coordination to lead them into massive burn zones. Detroit's fires raged out of control, but burned away entire infected hordes. And in Buffalo, Ellen's team rescued crucial samples literally minutes before infected breached the lab. When the cold front finally passed, 3 very different victories had been won. Chicago was partially cleared, its remaining infected destroyed. Detroit burned, but strategically, preserving vital industrial zones. Buffalo's medical district was secure, its samples safe. Final report. Ellen's tired voice came through as dawn broke. The virus isn't just spreading, it's building something. A network, a hive mind. Every infected we leave alive makes the others stronger. Whitmore looked at the tactical map, at the growing zones of green showing secured territory. They'd won battles, saved cities, gained crucial knowledge. But the war was evolving into something none of them had expected. Spring's coming, he said quietly. And now we know, we're not just fighting to survive anymore. We're fighting an enemy that thinks, plans, and learns. Sir, Mitchell approached with new reports. Survivor communities as far south as Kentucky are requesting our burn protocols. They want to fight back. Whitmore touched his wedding ring, thinking of Catherine's determination. The dead were organizing, but so were the living. And the living had something the infected didn't: the ability to innovate, to create, to believe in more than mere survival. The last cold front had passed, but humanity's fight was just beginning. Spring's Reckoning, Part 4. The network isn't perfect, Ellen explained, her presentation displayed across the PEOC's main screens. It has limitations, weaknesses. The infected need proximity to share information effectively. The colder they are, the slower the exchange. President Whitmore studied the data from all 3 city operations: Chicago's cluster battles, Detroit's strategic burns, and Buffalo's research had given them their first real understanding of what they were fighting. "Show me the spread pattern again," he requested. The tactical display lit up with a visualization of infected information sharing. Chemical markers spreading like ripples through groups of dead, each carrying tactical data, environmental adaptations, and combat experience. "Sir," Jamie called out, "temperature updates from secured zones. We're seeing consistent warming trends. The spring thaw is beginning." "What about the success rates?" Carlton asked Ellen. "City by city?" "Chicago cleared approximately 60%, but their remaining infected are highly organized. Detroit ... Ellen paused, checking her data. "Detroit's burns took out 80%, but at massive infrastructure cost. Buffalo, we managed 40% clearance, but secured crucial research zones." Sarah added from her station, "Survivor reports coming in from all 3 cities. Chicago's finding more holdouts every day, people who hid through winter. Detroit's industrial zone is already getting repair teams. Buffalo's medical infrastructure is almost intact. Different approaches, different results," Whitmore mused. "But the real question is, what happens when spring releases everything we couldn't clear?" Ellen's face grew grave. "The samples tell a story we don't want to hear. Every infected that survives makes the network stronger. They're not just sharing information, they're building a kind of collective intelligence. The more that thaw together, the smarter they'll be," Carlton finished. "Sir," Mitchell interrupted. "Urgent report from the Chicago perimeter. They're seeing new behavior in the surviving infected clusters. They're building things." The feed showed infected working together, using debris to create crude barriers, directing others to weak points in the defensive lines. They moved sluggishly in the cold, but with terrible purpose. Not just sharing information, Ellen realized. They're implementing it, learning from every encounter with our forces. "Dad," Jamie called out, "weather forecast for the next month. We're looking at rapid warming. Once it starts." Whitmore studied the tactical map. 3 major cities partially secured, but countless others still frozen, waiting for spring to release their hordes. And now they knew. Those hordes would emerge smarter, more coordinated, more dangerous. "Show me everything north of the 42nd parallel," he ordered. "Every major population center we haven't cleared." The map lit up with potential threats. Dozens of cities still hosting frozen infected, each one a ticking time bomb of networked intelligence waiting to thaw. "Sir," Carlton stepped forward, "we could expand the Detroit protocol. Strategic burns before the thaw. And destroy every city we haven't cleared. There has to be another way." Whitmore turned to Ellen. "You said the network has limitations, weaknesses. What if we use that?" Ellen's eyes lit up with understanding. "Proximity. They need to be close to share information effectively. If we could disrupt their ability to cluster." "We segment the cities," Sarah suggested, already marking potential barrier zones on the map. "Use what we learned in Chicago. Create kill zones that prevent large groups from forming." "But we'd need time," Carlton warned. "Materials, manpower." "Sir," Mitchell approached with new reports. "We're getting volunteer requests from every secured community. People want to help prepare other cities. They've seen what works, what doesn't." Whitmore thought of Catherine, of her belief in human cooperation. The infected were building a network of shared knowledge. Fine, humanity would build its own. Get me all surviving city leaders above the 42nd parallel, he ordered. Ellen, prepare briefing packets. Everything we've learned about disrupting infected clustering. Jamie, coordinate with weather service to predict thaw patterns. Sarah, work with the wind riders to map potential barrier zones in every major city. What exactly are we planning, sir? Carlton asked. We can't clear every city before spring, Whitmore explained, but we can prepare them. Use what we learned in Chicago, Detroit, and Buffalo to give them a fighting chance. We're going to create a network of the living. As orders went out and preparations began, Ellen's voice came through softly. Tom, Catherine would love this. Using their own tactics against them, turning their strength into a weakness. Outside, the temperature continued to rise, but in command centers, survivor communities, and secured zones across the northern states, humanity prepared its response to the coming thaw. They had learned, adapted, and most importantly, they had learned to work together. Spring was coming, and this time, the living would be ready. Spring's Reckoning, Part 5. Cleveland barricades are complete, reported Sarah, marking another green zone on the tactical map. Pittsburgh's segmentation walls are at 80%. Cincinnati began their final preparations this morning. President Whitmore watched the network of the living take shape across the northern states. Every surviving city implementing lessons learned from Chicago, Detroit, and Buffalo. Every community preparing for the moment when spring would release the frozen dead. Temperature at 33 degrees in outer zones, Jamie announced. The thaw is beginning. Show me the pattern, Whitmore ordered. The weather map displayed the warming trend, a wave of thaw moving southward from Canada, releasing infected populations one city at a time. But this time, humanity wasn't hiding. Sir, Ellen's face appeared on the main screen, excitement breaking through her exhaustion. The Buffalo samples, we've found something big. The network has a maximum effective range, she explained, sending data to the tactical display. When infected clusters grow too large, they actually start to degrade each other's signals. It's like signal interference. Carlton leaned forward. You're saying there's an upper limit to their coordination? More than that, Ellen continued. The larger the group, the more they depend on the network. If we could disrupt it somehow. Dad, Jamie interrupted. Multiple reports coming in. Infected showing activity in Cleveland's outer zones. Temperature just hit 34. The feeds showed the horror of spring's arrival. Frozen infected beginning to move, to twitch, to coordinate. But something was different. Sir, Sarah pointed to the tactical display. Look at the movement patterns, the segmentation walls. They're working. The infected can't form large enough clusters to share information effectively. They watched as Cleveland's carefully designed barriers channeled the thawing infected into predetermined zones, preventing the massive coordinated groups they'd seen in Chicago. Report from Pittsburgh, Mitchell announced. Their first burn zones are operational. They're using the Detroit protocols, but controlled, strategic. Whitmore studied the patterns. Humanity had learned, adapted, prepared. But so had the infected. The real test was just beginning. Tom, Ellen's voice cut through the tactical updates. There's more. The Buffalo samples, we've found evidence of signal degradation over time. The older the infection, the weaker the network connection. It's like their ability to coordinate actually burns out eventually. The implications hit everyone in the command center. Carlton was the first to speak. If we can keep them separated long enough, they lose their ability to work together, Whitmore finished. All these walls, these barriers we've built, They're not just tactical, they're strategic. Sir, Jamie's voice was urgent. Mass movement detected in Cleveland's eastern sector. The infected, they're trying something new. The feeds showed infected working together in unprecedented ways, using debris as tools, creating makeshift ramps over barriers, sacrificing some to help others advance. They're innovating, Ellen warned. The network is teaching them, showing them how to overcome our defenses. But then something remarkable happened. As the infected group grew larger, their coordination began to falter. Individual infected started moving randomly, their shared purpose dissolving into chaos. Signal interference, Ellen breathed. Just like the samples showed, they've hit critical mass. Whitmore watched as Cleveland's defenders seized the moment, using the infected's own numbers against them. Fire teams struck at the disorganized hordes, while Wind Riders led coordinated strikes against smaller, still organized groups. Sir, Sarah reported, similar patterns in Pittsburgh. Cincinnati. The infected are thawing, organizing, then falling apart when their numbers grow too large. This is it, Whitmore realized. The balance point. We don't have to kill every infected. We just have to keep them separated long enough for their network to burn out. As reports flooded in from cities across the network of the living, a new strategy emerged. The living weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting a war of attrition against the infected's own weaknesses. Ellen, Whitmore called. Get this data to every city in the network. I want every defender to understand what we're really fighting. He turned to Carlton. General, coordinate with all commands. We're not just holding the line anymore. We're going to push back. Dad, Sarah said softly, holding up Catherine's photo. Mom would say this is perfect. Using science to understand our enemy. Using knowledge as a weapon. Outside, the spring thaw continued its inexorable march southward. But in cities across the north, humanity stood ready. Walls segmented infected populations. Burn zones waited for critical mass. Defenders understood their enemy's weaknesses. The dead were rising from their winter freeze to find the living hadn't just survived. They had prepared, adapted, and learned to fight back. All commands, Whitmore ordered, execute spring protocol. The network of the living is now active. The war for survival had become a war of intelligence, of adaptation, of coordination, and humanity had just found its winning strategy. Spring had arrived, but this time the living were ready.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that story as much as I did. Come back next time for some more scary stories. And as always, remember to face your fears.